when I wrote my article on Zipix or Zipnix, I called him the best support player in the world. And sort of understandably, in a reply or a comment in response to that article, someone wanted to try to start an argument with me that it was not Zipix who is the best support player in the world. That was instead Coldzera, because Coldzera is obviously a better player than Zipix. He's like an arguable top 3, 4 player in the world, and perhaps even the best player in the world, depending on definitions and criteria and whatever else. But the reason why I thought of Zipnix as being the best support player in the world, obviously, is that I don't think of Coldzera as being a support player necessarily. And this is a very debatable, questionable topic. And I thought I'd try to delve into this in this video. Because in some ways you think of Coldzera as doing things that are very archetypically similar to what you would think a support player would do, or your conception of what a support player would do. But at the same time, when you think about the style of SK or the means through which SK succeeds, it very much is dependent or seems dependent on Coldzera. You think of him as a centerpiece or a linchpin or a star of that team, right? So there's this conflict in the terms and in your own sort of conception of him, which is why I think people talk about this topic a lot. So the first place to start is, if you're going to call Coldzera a support player or not, you have to define what support player means. And this is my personal definition, and this will sort of get into why I think he's not a support player, or not quite a support player. I think of star player and support player as being on a spectrum together. And I know there's a lot of argumentation on what a support player means. You see Thorn going back and forth with Moses on counterpoints sometimes, and you have other people throwing in their opinion too, where Moses doesn't think that support player exists because there's just not one guy who is set to just throw grenades or just augment the success rate of other players. There's not just guys falling around star players just trying to help him out. That doesn't exist. You have to have impact as an individual in your own aim battles and your own CT positions, right? But I think the Thorn argument is that it's on a spectrum, that some players are more supportive or less supportive. Now, I like to tie that with the stars, right? The star player isn't necessarily the guy who has the most success, though that's how I think most people typically define who the star player is. I think of star as a position on the team that's a spectrum between star and support, that the stars are going to try to be set up in positions where they can most affect the game through individual efforts, while the supports are guys who try to augment the success rate of those stars, or just do things that anyone could do, or that can be more reliably done, that it's not dependent so much on skill, it's more dependent on team play and just being there, just doing things that are hard or mundane, like, say, entering in a spot where you're really likely to die, or holding a really hard CT spot, or holding a CT spot where you just have to throw utility and delay and wait for your teammates then do something. It's not a spot where you can just get a 3K spray down or something like this, or take really important aim duels. That's how I think of support player. So thinking about it this way, in terms of spectrum from star to support, you have to think about Coldzera in context with this team to define whether or not he's a star player or a support player. And of course, SK is a team who recently had a change roster-wise, and have changed over time. So I guess I'll go through it in terms of where I thought of Coldzera within the context of his team across the various lineups of SK. I'm not going to go all the way back to like Kaboom. Well, I guess Coldzera wasn't on that team. But I'll just do from like FNX on. So with FNX, I think FNX and Taco were more the supportive end. Fur was more in the middle, and then it was Fallen and Coldzera who were more the stars of that team. While on the CT side, I think Coldzera is generally more of like a 3 or 4 player. Like, in my previous video where I talked about CT positions and naming train CT positions from 1 to 5, I called Ivy like a 4 position. And I think that's sort of a position, those sort of positions where it's more not about straight aim, maybe not straight aim, but straight individual skill, but also a lot of positioning, a lot of utility uses. I think that's where Coldzera succeeds. And he also succeeds in places where he's allowed to survive through the mid-round. So straight up confrontations aren't always sort of spots where he wants to play in, right? Because he wants to take advantage of how good he is in the mid-round. So, so on the CT side, I think that he does play spots that aren't typically what you think of as being star-oriented. They are very oriented for his own individual game. But why I think of Coldzera as being a star on SK during the FNX era and actually the Luminosity/SK era, when they're at the peak of their powers in the maybe March through July 2016. Yeah, March. When did MLG Columbus happen? March, like late March. But yeah, anyway, what he did on the T side was, or what the team did on the T side, what I thought they had a very deliberate structure, which was trying to get to a mid-round scenario, and SK was or Luminosity/SK was very good in mid-round scenarios because of the amount of theory and coordination they had as a team, or practice they put into theory, which led to better coordination as a team. I think Zeus, after he left SK in... So this must have been August or September 2016. I think he was on an episode of Counterpoints, or maybe it was a Reflections interview with Thorin. He said that like half their practice time was dedicated towards learning theory. So learning what to do in X scenario in unpredictable or uncommon scenarios. I think this is what SK sort of built their game around. I think they had two ways of getting to like a 3v3 or 4v4 on the T side. The first way, which is I think one that sets up Coldzera for success a lot, is the double op setup. So I think SK on T side used a very high amount, especially in context with their peers, of double op setups, which are obviously very expensive and more conducive to the CT side, where they try to gain space through getting picks and poking and prodding with ops. Now, they also could do really fast rounds, very execute-heavy, straightforward rounds with Taco and Fur, trying to create the action, trying to make initial contact instead. But I think in either scenario, which really they're trying to do is trying to get Coldzera and get SK generally, but Coldzera into scenarios where it's just wit against wit, coordination versus coordination. Scenarios where each team has to think their way through, and the more coordinated team, the more teamwork-oriented team can win. And Zeus, I think in that interview, in that episode of Counterpoints, even said that not only Coldzera would be the basis, the piece through that SK will try to win the round through, the weapon that the SK will try to win the round through. He'll also even take over the calling from Fallen and coordinate all that as the leading player, as the dictator of the action. So in many ways, I think the T side rather is set up around Coldzera in that era of the team, and yeah, that's why I think of him as being a star player in that FNX era of that roster. Now, as we go into the Phelps era of the roster, I think that at first, or initially, I think Coldzera was actually taking a back seat, and that it was more Fur and Phelps who were the two star players of that team. I think it's a chicken or the egg scenario. I was confused about this at the time. I'm still confused. You saw Fallen's individual numbers dip a lot at this very beginning period, like these first three tournaments you saw with SK with Phelps, which were DreamHack Masters Las Vegas, IEM Katowice, and Star Ladder I-League Star Series Season 3, because it was either that Fallen just had really bad individual performance, which led him to playing a more supportive role in the team, or because he was playing a more supportive role in the team, that he wasn't allowed to, he wasn't having as good of individual performances. But either way, and because that Phelps was a more aggressive player in comparison to FNX, you see in this era of the team, Furr and Phelps, especially on the T side, but I guess it's on the CT side as well, them leading a lot of the action and them really dictating rounds. So it's not that Furr or Phelps would just try to do something risky and they try to get some trades and then lead to a scenario where Coldzera can succeed in the resulting 2v3, 3v2, 4v4, whatever, just a mid-round scenario, really, a man down or limited personnel mid-round scenario. It was more that Phelps and Furr were the units where like they were moving so far up and so fast on the map that it seemed that SK were just trying to, and sometimes unsuccessfully, and this is why I think they struggled in this period a bit, catch up to them and sort of be dictated by, sort of pulled on the nose like a cow, the cow with the ring on his nose. You're sort of pulled by the nose and just led around the map by Furr and Phelps and dictated to. And that's why Coldzera wasn't, I don't think, always had success individually in this initial period. He was more and more as a support player, just like Fallen. They do less double up setups, and he was less set up to succeed as a individual player as on the T side. Now I think generally on the CT side, his roles stay pretty consistent. I talked about Train in my last video and how I say he's like a 4 role on, like, he's the second most. I think Ivy is the second most supportive role on Train. Yeah, that's the position he plays. Now that's yeah. So maybe in general across all map he's more like a 3 or a 4, but yeah, sort of that area. I think that's pretty consistent across lineups, but it's really what changes from lineup to lineup is the T side. Now with Phelps over time, you saw him becoming more and more supportive. And I think as that happened, you see Phelps really becoming the number 3 man on the Phelps. Yeah, I thought I said Furr, but yeah, Phelps being more the 3 man on that team, like the third, the middle guy between star and support, or it sometimes even felt like Fallen was the 3 guy. But I thought that it was at the very beginning. It was more that it was Furr and Phelps, the 2 star players, and that was Coldzera sort of in the middle, but that more and more as Phelps sort of grew into SK, and this maybe be why he sort of had trouble with the team or didn't enjoy playing with the team as much, is that he sort of was falling back in the pecking order, that he was allowed to create the action and dictate SK on the, or just play individually and try to create action on his own on the T side. And this led to, I think, when you play a more conservative, not conservative, so somewhat conservative, it was more like, I feel like more towards the end, it was either Fallen or Furr trying to create action, trying to create initiative, and not them in tandem, because they're obviously one has a knob and one has a rifle. Either poking or prodding on either side of the map, and that creates the opening, and that allows the mid-round scenario to start or get the action flowing, and then Coldzera is activated, where before it was the combination of Furr and Phelps, and that sort of really controlled the whole team because they had to follow up on them, because it's such a, it's a greater portion of their team, it's 2 people versus just 1 person making a push. So yeah, I think in this sort of era of the team, later in the SK with Phelps era, I think Coldzera started to get back up there as like the 1 or 2 guy on the T side again, and make me think of him as more of a star player. Now with the Bolts lineup, I think it's a lot more of the same, and you see Boltz being a very supportive player. I mean, a lot of people said that he's more of like an FNX type of player, which again has led to Fur or Fallen leading the action more on the T side. Now, I haven't seen them do necessarily the same double op setups as much, and it actually is interesting talking about train specifically. You saw Taco take up the double op on the CT side, and even sometimes on the T side on train, and now that's Bolt's doing that. So it's a little different. It's more similar to the late SK with Phelps era sort of play. It's very similar to that, but we'll see if that transitions more towards like the more FNX style, or maybe that's just fallen out of the meta with the rise of FSMGs making ops less tenable or less affordable. But anyway, yeah, you see Coldzera still being, I think, in this era as like the lead guy or the number 2 guy, or probably just the lead guy, the most important player on the T side for SK. Now, in general, it's hard. When you think of him as being sort of a middle of the pack guy on the CT side, and then a star player on the T side, maybe he's more middling than people would want to give him credit for. Like maybe overall, if you want to average it out, he's more of like a middling player. But maybe what I'm trying to describe here, that there's a differentiation between the CT side and the T side, and even I think pistol rounds a lot. You'll see him buy utility instead of armor. So this is another facet where he's more supportive, or a more supportive player rather than a more star-oriented player. But at the same time, you think specifically on the T side that the game is centered around him, and this is probably the sort of duality of Coldzera, which is sort of at the conflict at the heart of this argument, that in some realms on pistol rounds on CT sides, he's more supportive, where on T sides I think he's more of a centerpiece of the team. Now at the same time, if you look at CT positions, when he does when he plays a more positional role or more team-oriented role, I mean, that almost, like, again, is doing the same thing where, okay, so he's not taking the initial duel, trying to do the big spray down, or he's not taking initial battles, he's more falling back, more relying on his teammates, but that, again, sets him into a position where he's alive in a mid-round scenario, in a scenario where he's going to be alive. He's not going to just do straight up fights with people. He's going to be allowed to use his positioning to succeed. So even though that's not a role that necessarily allows for the most impact, it allows for his own most. It allows for him to have the most impact. So I think that's why I want to put him more towards like the star end of the equation rather than support. But I think there's this duality in play. But I think I think you understand my trepidation in calling him a support player. I mean, I think on the T side, it's just so much about Coldzera being a success, and you think of SK's success as a coordinated team, as a mid-round team, and that Coldzera is at the center of that. It's hard to call him a support player.